Good evening. I'm Professor Sarah Wendt and I'm currently Director of the Social Work Innovation Research Living Space, or SWIRLS, or the new research centre at Flinders Uni based in social work. I'm also currently Discipline Head of Social Work in the College of Education, Psychology and Social Work at Flinders University. And tonight I'm your host for the evening. But firstly, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of country. The Flinders social work team recognise that Flinders social work discipline operates on the traditional lands and the waters of the Kaurna peoples, and we pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge their sovereignty and continued responsibility to care for country. We respect the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges, languages and spirituality and their relationship with country. We are committed to truth-telling about the history of social work education and practice in this state, and working in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities to achieve our shared vision for reconciliation. And I would also just like to pause and acknowledge the cultural authority in the room here with us tonight. I'm also now just going to do a quick emergency exit advice for you all. So before we can commence this evening, please note, firstly, that tonight's lecture is being recorded, but please be reassured the recording happens from here up, okay? So the audience actually isn't recorded. Their emergency exits are located outside of these doors. Through the glass sliding doors, and you turn right to the stairwell. So we just head straight out the glass doors, look for the stairwells, that's your exit. The meeting point is actually Victoria Square. Facilities can be accessed outside of these doors through the glass sliding doors and turn left down the hallway. So now it gives me great pleasure to actually introduce tonight's event. So welcome again, and thank you so much for joining us for this public lecture series titled the Social Transformation Lecture Series. If you wish to share this event with your peers, please make sure you hashtag social transformation in your tweets, and feel free to tweet as much as you like. Social transformation is not just a reflection of our college mission aiming to lead social justice initiatives and educational leadership. It's a call to action that harks back to the earliest days of our institution. As we at Flinders make inroads in our mission to change lives and change the world, we're focused on making a difference by extending the boundaries of knowledge, by trying to address the big challenges, and by changing lives for the better through our research, through our teaching, and our connections with you. Our founding Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Carmel, explained his ambitions for Flinders in the now famous quote, "We want to experiment and experiment bravely." It's a concept that has captured the imagination of successive generations of Flinders researchers and continues to inspire us today. Particularly in SWIRLS, our new research centre, our team are passionate about making a difference and advancing social work, social policy and research. And here in SWIRLS, we're committed to using a living lab approach. What do I mean? I mean bringing researchers, practitioners, policy people, anyone who engages with social work and related professions to co-design projects together. We've got a number of projects underway, with many of you actually here tonight, including research on domestic and family violence, child abuse and neglect. We partner with the Department of Child Protection, Housing SA and Rose Uniting Communities, just to name a few. But tonight, we're all here asking the question, how do we build more integrated services for vulnerable families? It's a driving question we often ask ourselves. And but what better way to lead this discussion by inviting Claire to come and talk to us about this tonight. So Claire is the CEO of Relationships Australia South Australia, and she'll present on the need to identify and remove roadblocks to improve collaboration between services. Having just recently returned from overseas, examples of restorative practices introduced in the UK will be explored, including how high challenge, high support strategies can shape services in the future. And so without further ado, please welcome Dr. Claire Ralfs.
So I'll just turn this on. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everybody. I'll just orient myself to technology. Oh, I can see myself over there. That's slightly odd. I'll try and not look there. I would also like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region and recognise their inherent cultural and spiritual beliefs, and recognise that they continue to sustain the living Kaurna people of today and who have survived, and I believe they also enrich the wider community's understanding about how we should live here. Sarah sort of summarised a bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I've got 5 things. The first thing is to really unpack a bit about how vulnerable families actually have a constellation of presenting issues combined with historical trauma or previous trauma and also intense feelings whenever they arrive at our services. And the sort of personal chaos that people experience meets our service system, which is the second point I want to unpack, which is that generally our services are organised around single issue presenting outcomes. And that's really the heart of how we continue to amplify each other's chaoses, really. I then want to really argue and explain how I believe better detection of the constellation of client issues combined with better integrated service pathways are really urgently needed. I would also like to sort of stress that I don't think that has to be hugely costly, because I think it's about how we behave and how we treat each other. And then finally, four, is families and children have to be active participants in our service strategies. They need not to be done to, they need to actually be really welcomed participants, and that's part of that cultural change that we need to make. And then integrated services can only come when we collaborate to actually not pretend the roadblocks aren't there, but to actively remove them. And so that's the flow of what I'm going to talk about. You could go now if you want. It's sort of got the headlines, in this sort of headline era. To put myself in context a bit, I am the CEO of Relationships Australia, and we've been providing sort of relationships counselling, previously called marriage guidance, since 1948. And today we deliver a whole different suite of programs that often, not only do people sometimes think Relationships Australia is a dating agency, but they often just think that it is marriage guidance or the modern version of. But actually, this suite of programs is quite comprehensive and they're all related, actually. So relationships counselling, family dispute, children's contacts service for separated couples, family mental health services, gambling help, specialised family violence, post-out-of-home care, post-adoption, children's therapeutic services, child and family assessment and referral networks, CFANs, Western, and flexible learning option programs for school disengaged young people. There are more, because there's something like 43 contracts, but they're the main ones that people often don't notice that we do. And it's from delivering those services that I guess I'm speaking tonight. We see greater than 15,000 clients per annum in our clinical services. If you put our training and community programs with that, that goes up to about 27,000 people. But most of the data that I'm about to present, it relates really to those 15,000. So 55% of them are female, 39% of them are male, 15% are culturally and linguistically diverse, and 7% of them are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that's a bit of the sort of overall makeup of us, of who we see. The profile of their issues is interesting. And so more than 25% of them live at or below the poverty line. Greater than 60% of service delivery involves family violence issues, doesn't matter what service you come to. 34.4% seek help about their own unsafe behaviour. 1 in 10 need a suicide prevention plan at their first appointment. 1 in 7 request support for their risky alcohol and drug use. Greater than 50% have significant parenting stress. And I really need you to understand that that's people who come to us for gambling. They don't come to us for parenting or that. So in fact, the people who come to us not about their children have more parenting stress than the people who come to us about their parenting. So that tells you anybody that's living with these issues is dealing with significant stress. 1 in 7 say their children have been subject to a child protection notification. And on entry to our gambling help service, just over 40% of clients have severe functional impairment and 43% have severe psychological distress. So that's sort of, I guess, takes you away from the idea that we're just dealing with the worried well, that people that are dealing with relationships issues, once they reach out to services, are usually in a pretty bad way. It's no different from the sort of, that profile is very consistent with what we know in Australia about women being murdered each week by their current partner, women experiencing domestic violence between the ages of 15 and 44, 1 in 6. By age 15, 40% of children will have experienced parental separation. Anxiety and mood disorders are twice as likely for separated and divorced adults. Abuse and alcohol, illicit drug use are much more likely for separated and divorced adults, as is suicide, actually. And about 1 in 4 Australians report that they're lonely, and about 1 in 4 Australian children will be reported to Child Protection Services by age 10. So we're talking about, as John Lynch, I think, said last year, we're talking about epidemics. We're not, if these were health statistics, comparisons to heart disease or diabetes, we're talking epidemics. So when a client arrives at our service, any of your services, and to the first available service, because there isn't a lot of brand loyalty in this sector, they come choosing an issue. For us, it might be gambling, it might be family dispute, it might be any number of things, financial counselling. And they come usually fairly distressed. However, they come actually with a mosaic of issues that sit behind them that is maybe not what they've actually gone to that service about. I give the example of financial counselling. Our financial counsellors are, often trained Certificate 4 to do good financial counselling, good at sorting out your debts. But they know that they're dealing with people who have extreme levels of family violence, got historical trauma of all sorts of ways, maybe mental illness, maybe they were abused and neglected themselves, maybe worried about their children, definitely worried about their children if they've got any. Dealing with loss, dealing with discrimination, dealing with community conflict. So the first available service not only meets that presenting problem, but is actually meeting a mosaic of issues. And on top of that, they're meeting a lot of intense feelings, maybe shame and humiliation. Shame and humiliation that may be actually making it hard also for them to tell us about some of that mosaic of issues. Anger and frustration, another lot of intense feelings. So that is what I would call the sort of client or family chaos that arrives at the first available service for whatever service it is in our sector. And we know that we don't actually live our problems as single issues, yet our services are oriented to single problems for lots of good reasons, lots of funding reasons, lots of professional reasons. And we understand which of these clients on the top line really belong with which of these practitioners on the bottom line. It's probably pretty true. We probably do know how to do that. But actually for the client, it looks like that. It's a spaghetti road of services that's very easy to get lost. And it's actually mostly the requirement of clients and who are distressed, who are in their own chaos, to navigate that spaghetti road. And you can see why it's really easy to not go there. Now, when I'm talking about service chaos, I really want to make it clear that I'm not talking about an incompetent service, because I work with lots of services. I don't believe that's what we work with. We work with differences and conflicts, but I'm not talking about that. What I'm characterising as service chaos is that we are working in a sector that's at epidemic proportions, and yet we've heard Leah Bromfield last year and John Lynch and a number of others explain how there isn't a good evidence base about what works in this sector. And I think it's because it's a hard sector, partly because of those spaghetti roads, to actually research as well. It's not easy to do random controlled trials in our sector, and that's part of how we form knowledge and evidence. So that's a problem. Often, again, from Leah's work, staff are not adequately prepared or qualified to deliver the program that they've actually maybe even chosen. It's maybe there's been shortcuts, or they didn't get trained properly, or actually knowing a lot of our sector, they probably just wanted to modify it a bit because they trust their work, which again, I believe there's a place for that, but that does make it difficult in terms of some of the delivery. The intensity of service is often not enough. The wrong dosage, that sort of technology. Too little, too late, or not long enough, or too much to the wrong person, which is the next thing. Services may be delivering a good program, but to the wrong client. And then, of course, you've got siloed and disjointed services, and you've got short and discontinuous funding. So that's what I mean by service chaos. I don't think there's any one organisation responsible for that. I don't think there's one department responsible for that. I think that's the service chaos we're dealing with, and we're dealing with very complicated people. So we know, and we've seen all the policy frameworks, I think, that go around this, joined up services, wraparound services, collective impact, continuum of coordinated care, no wrong door. We need all of it. They're really important. I think the point is they're not in place. And I think that's the question, I guess, that I'm interested in us understanding. What would it take to put them in place? Is it another policy? Is it another Royal Commission? Like what would it take to actually get them in place? And I think it's about walking the talk of collaboration is actually what it comes down to for me. And I'll talk a bit later about what I was inspired by in the Leeds visit and engagements. But I also just want to talk a bit about how I conceive this anyway. Because I do think that we need to reconceive collaboration, because it's a very easy word to say, and we all say it. It's a bit like any of those other words. We can just go, oh, we do that. But I think what needs to be at the collaboration table is children, their voices at the very least, and families and communities, and they need to be equal partners at this table. They need to be present. There needs to be multiple services, and often when we think of collaboration, we think just multiple services. I think there needs to be cultural expertise at the table, and I think that needs to be brought to the table rather than relying on our clients to educate us culturally as well as advocate for what they need and deal with their family issues. And then there needs to be professional expertise. I think there's a real role for, if we're going to change anything, and again, I think in medicine, or dentistry actually is my favourite one, I want my teeth done by people who are very proficient. I do not want people who are experimenting on my teeth. I think our families are entitled to have access to that same professional expertise. I think we've got to be clear about how we work with professional expertise. And then I also think that needs to be at the table is data and evaluation. And I think data and evaluation needs to not dominate, but just like I don't think professional expertise should dominate, but I think it needs to be a partner. And I think we need to welcome it as a partner, and we need to make it do its work, just like we need the family to do their work and we need the services to do their work. Everybody's got to do their work at this collaborative table. At RASA, and can't talk without talking about doors, it's short, but doors has been a really important framework for us walking the talk of collaboration internal to RASA. And part of that is it starts with this client self-report, which, because even though we do still have single focused services, we holistically ask about all of these issues because we know they're interrelated. And we ask about them as a starting point of engaging with clients about what we need to engage with them about. Not to be the heroes to solve it all, but to know these issues exist. And so that's the start. And that's a quantitative process in doors. It's closed-ended questions. So staff have had to learn to deal with data and patterns and understand how to read that. But what's really important is it doesn't stop there. It has to be, I can't know my dots. It has to be followed up by this practitioner elaboration and response. And that's the hand-in-glove thing of quantitative and qualitative, professional judgment and client perspectives. So that first appointment is an engagement about this complex set of issues. And again, our financial counsellors are capable of doing this. They're not then going to deal with the issues that come up of domestic violence or the children's issues, but they're going to know about them, and they're going to sequence their service in a timing that works for the client. They're not going to just go, well, I only deal with financial counselling, I'm only going to deal with your debts. Now, we know that that's usually a fairly first-up service because that's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress, but they know how to work with the other services. And at this stage, that started as just internal RASA services, but that is more and more external to RASA services. And then the third part of doors that's really important is the recognition that maybe more risk assessment needs to happen. The first two steps may really map the area, but the third one is about what else is really, where's the professional expertise we need to bring in here? And let's again not take on things we can't do. People that need acute mental health services still need financial counselling. It's not one or the other, and we've got to remember that spaghetti road of services, and we can't leave them to that. We've got a responsibility to deal with that. So doors organises that for us, and on top of it, it also, in particularly that middle box, really does allow the protective factors to emerge in that conversation. Unlike what a lot of people think when you do a quantitative assessment or risk screening process at the beginning, people think that's insulting. They think that's often rude to our clients that have got this mosaic of issues behind them. But actually there is really very powerful evidence that says it's actually easier for clients to tell you on a closed-ended tick box than to face-to-face try and explain to you what's gone on for them, okay? It's voluntary, they don't have to, they can keep it secret if they want to, but you're conveying a very powerful message that goes, I'm interested in these things, I need to know about these things, which really undercuts shame, really undercuts humiliation. And we know from the research we've done with our own clients is how much they appreciate being asked. I've had other practitioners say, yes, some of the things that they learnt in the first session in previous practices would take them 10 sessions to actually get to know the depth of that history. So it's really important. And we also know that from repeated research that you will miss 50% of risks if you are ad hoc or idiosyncratic and not systematic. So they're the reasons to do it. And it's got as many positive engagement, problem-solving foundations for the client as, much more positive ones than negative ones. Basically, I would say DOORS helps us map complexity and opportunities. And we've been doing it since 2013. And I think the key thing in terms of the collaboration picture is that practitioners feel totally fine and reassured about reaching out to other services. It actually helps eliminate that expectation that I should be able to do this on my own. I should be able to sort this out. It underpins that reaching out to the proper service. So it's a win-win for everybody, and it's much better sorts of collaboration. But Leeds have a lot to say about collaboration as well. That was our mapping of getting out of client complexity and service complexity. But Leeds definitely, and I think it was Anne-Marie who did brought the Leeds people to Adelaide the first time, where I know when I saw them, I thought, oh, well, that all sounds too good to be true. I used some of Nigel Richardson. I don't know if people know Nigel Richardson's words later on because he's so clever with his words, and he manages to summarise it. But I thought they were too good to be true, so several of us went to look at them, and I had the good fortune to go again with colleagues Kathy and Anne-Marie, who are here tonight. And what is astounding really is that in that journey they moved from being classed as an unacceptable children's service needing intervention in 2009, very similar to things that happened in Adelaide, through this process of satisfactory in 2011, through to good in 2015, through to outstanding in 2018. So they have some pretty impressive results. They've reduced the number of children going into care. They're internationally recognised. Not only, I think the week before we went there or the week after we went there, Morocco was there, Ireland's been there, Sweden's on their way there. Everybody goes to have a look at Leeds. They're very generous in what they show. Fundamentally, they argue for and show a restorative practice process, a philosophy of restorative practice, and they fundamentally changed their culture using restorative practice, which, a definition of that is it's a way of helping build and maintain healthy relationships, resolving difficulties, and repairing harm. And they don't just use it when things go wrong, they use it as their way of developing positive and robust working relationships. It's the theme that we heard constantly, and if anybody's been to their training, it's the thing you will have heard as well. It's summarised in a very interesting diagram here. High challenge, high support is the aim, to work with people, not for them, which is low challenge, high support, or to them, high challenge, low support, or low challenge, low support, which means doing nothing, really, or not much, because there's no challenge, there's no support. They used this process with their leadership team first. And again, that was another thing that was echoed. They didn't just use this with their families, they used this with themselves, and they used it across their organisation. And they, again, say that's how they started. That's where they started, is with themselves. This is one of Nigel Richardson's summaries. It took leadership, really, and I think that's really important, and that leadership needs to be based on unwarranted optimism, acceptance that crisis is the norm, endless curiosity, and an absence of paranoia and self-pity. I think our sector needs those sort of reminders. I think it's easy to get into that. I think we cry poor. I think we feel very burdened by what we're dealing with, which I think we have reason to be thinking that, and it easily turns to paranoia and self-pity. So I think it's on us all, and leadership not being just the same as management, but being a way of behaving in the sector. I think it's something we all need to be reminded of. They also have a big emphasis on family-led group conferencing, which I think is a very challenging idea, and it's to do with high challenge, high support. And they have a group of family group coordinators who are different from their child protection workers. And I think what I witnessed in that visit that was interesting is that the child protection workers could stay very solid on what the bottom line was that needed to change, and the family group conference coordinators could negotiate with the family, which is a big job. It's about doing lots of preparation, lots of one-to-one work with every member of that family, with their mosaic of intense issues behind them, doing lots of work to get them focused on the child's well-being, and really negotiate what the family has got resources and capability of doing to stay responsible for protecting the child. And it's a shifting of it out from the centralised process to the family. And I think that's really courageous, and I think it was really inspiring meeting the layers of workers in Leeds that work like that. That are able, and again, the way they could hand around their different services, excuse me, was very important. The key bit of it was building accountability among the family members, and we had the good fortune to meet family members who were sort of peer workers as well, who not only continue to support their family and hold their family accountable for their child protection plan, but also were advocates for other families going through this process. So they're definitely at the table. They're definitely at that collaboration table and a vital piece of it. And they'd learnt a lot, you know. So, and what I could see is the problem was not centralised. It was dispersed really to the family, which I think is a really important thing that they've done. And I think you can't do that if you've got the spaghetti road of services. You can't decentralise because everybody's on their track with their responsibilities and their agreements. So really, to conclude, I think not only do we need this table of collaborators with all those people, quite a few of these are Nigel Richardson's words, but, you know, start somewhere, it will lead everywhere. I think that's really important because I think we're waiting for the best policy or the best funding context, and really it's just about starting and heading off. Obsess about outcomes. They're using an RBA. For us at RASA, we're really focused on constantly looking at our data, looking at our outcomes, looking at how we can do repeat measures, because I'm interested in real evaluation of what is effective. And everything I've done so far would tell me that we should do more of it. We've got so much to be proud of in this sector that we should be putting it up there as evidence of what works. We need to understand patterns. We need to be absolutely able to tailor to the idiosyncratic needs of our distressed clients, but we need to understand patterns. We don't need to pathologise and we don't need to impose them, but we do need to understand them. A lovely Nigel Richardson thing, keep the complex simple but not simplistic. And I think we all know that we make things so complicated. One of my examples that was recently of, somebody needing to get kicked out of a housing service that our CFAN team were trying to work with that could find other places for her, but that housing service really needed to let her go 24 hours before we could get that in place. And it's because she'd broken all their rules. Understand it was all of that, but we needed 24 hours and that service couldn't do it. And again, I say that respectfully, knowing that there's good reasons for their experiences of it, but it's one of the ways we make simple things like rehousing her really complicated and put children at risk. We need to get beyond traditional dichotomies of quantitative versus qualitative, of professional versus community, statutory versus non-statutory. We really need to put them aside and learn what what role each of them has to play, and we need to make our new ways of working together. We need to engage with and strengthen diversity. That's professional diversity, that's service diversity, that's diversity of people, diversity of ways of working together, diversity of programs. We actively, open-heartedly need to learn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. Not only are they overrepresented in all of these processes, they have so much to teach us if we would genuinely partner with learning. And again, our service system has to structure that rather than just keep putting that on Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal families to do. And we need common frameworks. We need, if we're going to evaluate this, if we're going to work together, we've got to speak the same language. We've got to put effort into speaking the same language. We've got to stop being proprietorial about it. We've got to stop claiming ownership of it, and we have to have common frameworks. So thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Claire, for sharing how family services may be professionally organised and clinically coherent, but vulnerable families still find family services chaotic, confusing and unresponsive. And the question is, and we all know that how we address this complexity is the issue that we're here to discuss tonight. And so on that note, what I want to do is I'm going to invite some panel members to come and sit with Claire out the front. You're not getting away yet, Claire. So let me introduce firstly Ms Anne-Marie Hayes. Anne-Marie is Executive Director, Early Years and Child Development at the Department of Human Services. We also have Mr Craig Rigney, who is the Chief Executive Officer of KWY, which is an Aboriginal Specialist Family Violence Service. And we also have Ms Cathy Taylor, the Chief Executive of the Department for Child Protection. Thank you for joining us. Can we give the three a round of applause?
Turn it on.
So what we'd like to do now is I've got some...
Bloody hell.
I have some thought-provoking questions I'm going to ask the panel, having just listened to Claire's presentation. Just asking each one of the panel members a question, but please feel free to talk amongst yourselves in engaging in trying to answer these questions. We're going to let the panel just have the floor for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and then we're going to also then open it up to the floor if you've got some questions of Claire or the panel about this issue of chaos. So I'm going to start off with a question. We know that integration and collaboration, or as Claire also reminded us, joined up, wrapped around, no wrong door. We have these phrases. And we use these phrases because we have an idea that these are really good practice. Particularly, you'll see it in domestic and family violence services, child protection services, for example. And so it is the ideal that we all seem to be trying to reach for as service providers. Why do you think this is often so hard to achieve despite our very good intentions of it? And I'm going to hand over to Cathy, maybe to try and answer that first.
That's good. I'm laughing because I'm such a short ass. And, I'm trying to balance on the chair with legs that are quite not long enough to sit on the thing. Look, it's a great question. And for those of you who know my history, I'm one of those people who've worked in both child protection and domestic and family violence. And I think it is one of the, on one hand, it's one of the great vexed questions, but I actually also think if we could resolve and solve that, we would go a long way. I think Claire actually gave us some insights to one of the reasons and what's getting in the way. When you work in child protection, we have very clear frameworks that guide what we do. When you work in domestic and family violence, you have very clear frameworks in terms of what guides what you do. What we've not necessarily spent a lot of time doing is actually building the bridge between both child protection and domestic and family violence. So if I was going to pick one thing, and I'm not even going to attempt to, it was that last slide that Claire had up, which was the lovely one with, all of that. I'd be saying, let's do some work building, shared language, common frameworks, and I'd be thinking about values in terms of what underpins that. It's some of the work that we're starting to see play out. There are trials actually happening in other jurisdictions around the country. So for those of you who may be aware, there's a trial happening in Mount Isa at the moment, which is jointly funded by the Queensland Government of Child Protection and Domestic Violence, but the one service has been funded to actually provide the first front door. So think about that, you don't go looking for the service because today my need is, DV, and tomorrow it'll be parenting stress, and next week it'll be homelessness. Truth is, I'm struggling. So I think, Sarah, I could go on for ages. I really think Claire gave us a lovely insight, which is let's pay attention to a couple of things. Build a bridge. So let's do it through shared language, shared aspirations, and common frameworks.
Thank you, Kathy. Does Anne-Marie or Craig want to add anything before I might throw the next question your way?
Can't be that good.
Well, I think the only thing I'd add is I think that you've done a nice little summary, really, of the evidence, but also for those of us listeners here who are looking at how do we co-design. In fact, they're the things that are coming through very strongly from practitioners, from people who have lived experience, or service users, however you want to describe it. So those themes that Claire we are paying attention to, and I think we have an opportunity. I guess that's that extreme optimism. I do actually think we have an opportunity to do some of the things that Kathy and Claire have both identified, which is what would it look like to have a common framework? What would it actually look like if we didn't segregate off into, if you go that door, it's wrong. And I think we've got some examples, we have got exemplars of where that has worked, and I think we should look at how we scale that up, as opposed to think we have to do something brand new. And I think that's the other thing for me, is short-term projects, short-term pilots. Most of us have lived through many times when we go, God, that's working well, and it's defunded. Or the evidence isn't used. I see lots of nods. So if you've been around long enough, you're often been where you go, wow, if only we'd had a bit more time. So I think that learning from that and utilising the wisdom of that photo, really, that wisdom of everyone, including, I think, data and evidence is really critical, and we wouldn't have used that 10 years ago. Well, I know I didn't. Can't speak for everyone. And what that does do, it assists us to make the right decisions. It's not the only thing. We can't let that reign supreme either, because there's this whole idea that if you've got the data right, you're going to get the service right. Well, maybe not.
Do you want anything else, Craig? Otherwise, I'm going to ask you a question next.
I'll wait, Sarah.
Okay.
Sarah, can I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
And it's really interesting because you asked me a question about DV and child protection, and I know Claire will be able to relate to this. Interestingly, that interface between the two is now being asked in a much broader sphere. If any of you have looked at the recent Australian Law Reform Commission report that was led by Professor Sarah Derrington, and it's really looking at what's the future of family law and the family courts. And in fact, in the old days we used to talk about, the toxic trio, but it really has highlighted that if we can actually pay attention to those connections between child protection and domestic violence, and then think about how it actually plays out. We're all fixated about child protection when you work in child protection, but the vast majority of Australian families, yes, 1 in 4, or might be heading towards 1 in 3, might come to the attention of child protection, but actually a lot of Australian families aren't intersecting with child protection services. They're intersecting with family support services, the family courts and the family law. So I think and I know that, the family court have been talking to you, Claire, about this in terms of design. I don't think we should underestimate. It's not simply about state systems. There's a real opportunity about bridging this with the federal systems as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. Craig, if I could ask you the next question. I want to acknowledge that unfortunately Aboriginal families have experienced service chaos, and they experience unresponsiveness or punitive responses despite prolonged stress and trauma in their lives. Tonight, Claire's introduced us to this concept of restorative practice as a possible way forward to help build integration or collaboration, and therefore maybe help reduce chaos. From an Aboriginal agency's point of view, what potential do you see, but also what should we watch for to actually ensure cultural safety?
Well, in short, it's that is a very big, broad question with a huge response. So here's something that I've prepared earlier. And anyone that's seen me talk before, this is probably the first time I've ever used notes, because I can just go like a bull at a gate. And as I was listening to Claire, it's what I wrote this afternoon is it has absolutely just mirrored what Leeds was talking about in our own service. For those that don't know, KWI, we are funded by PMC and have been for the last 2 years on a pilot project, and have just got another 3 years funding for our Stronger, Safer Family Hubs, where we're working with Aboriginal families that have domestic family and sexual violence happening within those families, that the male perpetrator or the perpetrator of the family violence is still part of the family unit, and there's also child protection concerns. So we've been doing this for 2 years, and we are being evaluated from RAND, an American organisation, around what that has looked like, and we have had some fantastic outcomes from that. And at the heart of what we're doing, I haven't even looked at my notes yet, and at the heart of what we're doing is really that family groups conferencing and the restorative practice. So having said that, you know, I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Claire said, but when we talk about service chaos, unresponsiveness, and I have a list, and I'll warn people, thank God there's no one in the front row here, because I'll just be launching saliva at them, but we can avoid that for you people that are 2 rows back. When we talk about, you know, unresponsiveness and how that impacts families, we need to consider the family needs. We need to put a human face to it. And what I mean by that is we cannot go into a family home and judge the family from our own belief system. We cannot let our own attitudes and beliefs impair our responsibilities to the families and to the children. Now, you are coming from a place of inherent power, and you, I mean, as service providers. Our Aboriginal families know this, and they may respond accordingly. The trauma, the anxiousness, and the general feeling of helplessness plays heavily within our families, and is mainly due to the current system and its very punitive nature. When we look around and remembering that we're working within Aboriginal families where family violence is there, and it also may be, sibling violence. We're working with families where there's a perpetrator of violence onto a younger person in the family, and that younger person is perpetrating violence back to the mother and back to other siblings. So it gets very complicated from an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander context. I want to put a little scenario to you. Imagine that you're in your home and you have a calendar on your fridge, like most people do. On that calendar you have upcoming birthdays, you have children's school events, you have kids' sporting events, you have daughter or son's dancing classes, you have a night out at the movies with friends, perhaps a date night with your partner. You have a social event like a winery tour. We like a good winery tour. I have on my calendar the work I need to do around my home on weekends, and I need to put that in because my wife will book in a winery tour. We have the dog groomer booked in. So this is all on our calendar. I have upcoming holidays penciled in there as well. I have a dentist appointment, I have a doctor's appointment booked into that calendar. Some of us may have eyelash refill appointments.
Oh my God.
Not looking at anybody after our earlier conversation. Pedicure appointments, hairdressing, bookings, and the list goes on, doesn't it, Anne?
Yeah, it does.
So, you know, in the room, who has most of these things? Put your hands up. I know on the calendar, you know, most of us have these things on a calendar. It sounds like a lot of things to be wary of.
And work.
And work, exactly, you know. And when I look at my calendar and I see this stuff that my wife is constantly adding to the calendar, I start to stress out. I start to go, oh my God, how am I going to do all this? I've got a business to run. I've got to do everything that I need to do. Now, imagine if you have also had to add to that calendar some of this stuff. Mental health service appointment, for myself, a mental health service appointment for my partner, a mental health service appointment for my children or child, an AOD service appointment for myself, an AOD service appointment for my partner, a children's program to get to, a parents program to attend for mums, a parenting program to attend for dads, a financial counsellor to go and see, a DCP appointment to get to, a Centrelink appointment to get to, maybe Parents Next appointment to get to, a men's program for family violence, sexual violence to attend, a women's advocacy and or support program to get to for women who are experiencing family and domestic violence, on top of everything else that you've had to do in your general daily life. Now, I've got to get to every one of these appointments on every single day, and I've got to use public transport because I can't afford to use a car. So again, we're looking at what pressures we are putting on families from, when we're talking about chaos and systems not aligning and there is no coordination that's happening. I may have to load my Metro card up, and that takes 24 hours to get that money from A to B to get on a bus, to get there. But I don't get paid until the day before. So all of a sudden the stresses, the anxieties are placed upon me to do this. I have to attend all of these during school hours. None of these are at the same place. So I am now flying all over the state to meet some of these. If you miss one appointment, then the statutory agency is notified and there are serious repercussions for this. We see parents getting cutting off from Parents Next through Centrelink, and of course now we're talking about financial stress and the cycle begins again. They come to your house unannounced. They take pictures in my food cupboards. This treatment keeps me in a state of continuous trauma and creates anxiety for myself and for my family. I'm told which programs I must attend. My choices are limited, if I have a choice at all. Are they Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander specific? Do they understand my cultural needs, my religious needs, my cultural obligations? I don't know about everyone in the room here, but I'm feeling overwhelmed now just rereading this as I'm writing it. And I'm just thinking to myself now, if that was just one person, one family member, how am I going to cope with all of this? Now, we have services and agencies, departments that set a very high tempo for these families and want all these things to happen at once. And these are the Aboriginal families that we're working with. They have child protection concerns and family violence concerns that tell us exactly all of this stuff. I didn't make this up. This is what my staff are feeding back to me. This is what families are feeding back to me. So you cannot understand how, if I was a person on the receiving end of that, I would be able to stay calm. I would be able to be well balanced. I would not be able to feel anxious or even scared, because I wouldn't be able to do it. Our services need to realise that for positive change to take place, they must be willing to understand that they need to connect with families on their level. Families will not want to engage with you until you're willing to engage with them on the same level. That means in a culturally safe space. That means with respect and without prejudice or judgment. Because we know prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or fact, and that judgment is displaying an overly critical point of view, your point of view. Now, I want to ask you as a group all of this, but having said that, especially those last 2 points there around prejudice and judgment. Who would know this about me, about Craig? I was sexually abused as a child by an uncle, or that I became an alcoholic at 14 years old. I was heavily using drugs through my teens, through high school. I've broken my back twice. I have had 2 brain tumours. I've had 2 spinal tumours removed. In my early 40s, my mental health was so bad that I committed or attempted to commit suicide. Because of that and what has happened to me, I spent time in a psychiatric ward, which was wonderful, I must say. If anyone's seen One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that was my real life experience 8 years ago. It was a terrible, terrible place to be in. So you wouldn't know that of me sitting here. So why would you assume you know what is happening for the families that we are meant to be helping and that we are meant to be assisting? I hope that every one of you take time to reflect on your practice, that every one of you think about your clients and that what they may be going through, and importantly, that you do not show any judgment or prejudice towards those people. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Did that answer your question?
Part B.
I just wanted to say thank you, Craig, again for also reminding us of the lived experience of the everyday and to bring us back down there and notice it. Any response? Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think you do that was really very good to listen to, Craig, but also reminds us how we can other people so easily.
Yeah.
Because it's very important to recognise that lots of people bring their own stuff as well, and you're not a worker. But, you know, you have to be professional.
And we do it without realising it too a lot of the time.
Yeah, we assume things about people. You're quite right, and that's a really important thing to remember. That, in fact, I think someone said, I'm not sure I should say this if it's being recorded, like assumptions were the mother of all ups.
Yeah.
Sorry to swear, I said it quietly. You know, often us approaching people or situations assuming that we know is a really tricky thing.
But I also, Craig, feel like you've just demonstrated how important it is that we have family and children at the table collaborating with an understanding that just because they're living in complex, intense, traumatic situations doesn't mean that's the end point. In fact, if we believe that's the end point, then we really has nothing to contribute. Do you know what I mean? And it's the hope that you demonstrate by just describing what you've been through and now what you're doing that is actually something that we need to be able to visualise. And that's again what I liked in the framing of the restorative practice of the high challenge, high support is the preparedness to talk to families about that honestly and really, rather than feel like it's rude.
Yeah.
Because they're living with it. In fact, they're often doing a nice presentation for you, whereas the point is to actually allow our families that are living with that level of trauma to tell us about it, and it's our responsibility to make it not just culturally safe, but I think, you know, personally safe for anybody to reveal those things. And you have to believe that people can restore, which I think is the restorative thing. So I think you've demonstrated that for us.
I've got one more question which leads nicely for Anne-Marie, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So we've talked about these ideas about integration and collaboration, and I think Craig and Claire have now reinforced again the importance of including children and families in this journey. And so, Anne-Marie, do you just have any reflections about the importance of focusing on the early years and child development with these ideas?
Well, that's a sort of a big question as well. But no, I think it's interesting because one of the things we reflect on about a life course approach, or however you want to describe it, that the early years really do matter. And I think that what we know is some of the early life experiences, but also early life support and is really critical. And we often segment. So while I don't want to segment, if you actually think about where we could put our support, we can often put it for the early years, and I can see some colleagues from CAFS here. So we know that those early years where people may be able to enter somewhere where it's softer, safer, to get some early help, to be able to talk about the issues that they might have, are really critical, because children do catch up, but we do know that they can catch up, but it takes a lot to help them catch up if we don't do it in those early years. And I think that it's another thing that often we don't put as much attention on is understanding real, you know, what is normal sort of child development. I mean normal in the sense that there's a range, that it's not, you know, every child's the same, but we know within that range, how do we support children to do the very best they can? And also, I guess I go back to the social determinants of health, and I think if we can support children to have early years, to have as much as possible, and then get into school. That was one of our things, get them into a children's centre, get them into parenting. Playgroups, I see Craig here. Playgroups are proven, supported playgroups are amazing for both parents and children. Then you've actually you can start to hook them into things. And we all know that education opens it up. You know, illiteracy and innumeracy are really unhelpful, and that's starting really early. You know, and if you haven't been parented well yourself, knowing how to parent is not an easy thing. It's not natural. It's not normal and natural to understand child development. They're not normal and natural. So we as professionals can support, but also some of the programs out there where people are doing it together. So if some of you would have heard Learning Together at Home, which is really about how do we not in a way that's, again, stigmatising or blaming, but how do we support people to learn with their children? Those sorts of things are really critical. And it's often an easier way of doing it than to wait until later. And I mean, I don't know about you, I just come from education into DHS. We got moved over into a MOG machinery of government, which has really been fun. But a lot of people have had really bad experiences at school. You don't have to be, a lot of people have problems. It's a square, pond, you don't all fit. But if you are a parent and you've had trouble at school, you'll avoid school. You'll avoid that because it's a really authoritarian system in a sense. And it works for the mainstream, but not for many people. And so I saw many of you nodding, and I think if we can help people to get into those systems easily and then support them through, often we were talking about some of our children's centres, I don't know whether anyone's here, but getting an early years into a supported play group and understanding that it's actually a supported way, you can actually hold on to people till you get them into a system that will support them even more.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. We're keeping to time really well. So I'm going to open up to the floor if anyone has any questions. Just to remind you that you will not be on the video. It's only being videoed here, so don't stress. But you'll need to talk into the microphone to pick up the question that the panel can then ask. So does anyone, and can I just also, because we've only got about 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to ask you, if you do have a question, it's one. Don't try and slip in 2 or 3.
Oh, that's it.
Wow.
It's a try.
Hi, I was just wondering about the restorative programs in Leeds that you were able to go and see, and the process that they had for working with really complex family scenarios. And I'm assuming from the model that early in my career I saw restorative just as the first trial. I was actually at the first interviews in Sydney back in Glebe and Redfern, but I'm trying to imagine in this scenario, is it involving the children, the parents or carers or grandparent or whoever's involved, and how complex a case do they manage in that sort of restorative situation?
I'm going to kick off and you can bring it home, whoever on that. Look, what was really interesting, because I also had more to do with it from a restorative justice perspective, probably based on the New Zealand, conferencing models that we brought over to this country, particularly around youth justice. So having heard from Anne-Marie and from Claire and a number of others, I really wanted to see, and, I'm one of those people like, yeah, but are you really going to have the tough conversations? One of the things that really struck me is before they could deal with the question of families, they had to actually apply the restorative practice to themselves, and particularly about dealing with the harms and some of the experience in the past. And then they started at the leadership level and they practiced and they talked about, I kept noticing staff, go and talk to them and would say, look, Craig, by the way, last week when you said this about, in this meeting and you used this language, I really found that, quite disturbing and quite distressing. And I was thinking, I wonder how much this, trickles down into the organisation. What stunned us was Leeds took their senior leadership out of the room after the very first meeting. And we had 2 full days. So we're drilling, we're asking social workers, we're asking peer workers, we're asking families. The alignment of message was significant. And what came out of it was they grappled with the concepts of restorative practice each and every day. They also reflected to us, they've probably moved from the restorative now to more going into, and really they were saying it's about good social work practice, it's about relationship and actually honouring that. But what was interesting is they didn't see themselves as doing it to the families. They were really, this was the high challenge, high support element. They saw it doing it with, but they said it took them at least, I would have said 12 months before they could even, start doing that, to actually, first of all, deal with it in their leadership teams, then start to actually embed it in their staff. And the answer wasn't, quick, here's the sheep dip version of training that you all do. Great, you're restored, move on. In fact, they had to practice and step back and reflect upon their language. And look, I'm a lawyer by training, so even talking about reflection's pretty interesting. But, lots of practice. But can I just say to you, what I really, like Claire, really reflected upon and took away from there was it's not an overnight, it's a critically committed and invested commitment to doing things differently. And I saw real evidence that they were in it for the long haul. What was lovely was their politicians signed up for it. So one of their MPs came and sat and talked to us about how they did it. So they were really complex families that they were working with. They weren't trying to avoid hard child protection, but they actually had to embed it in their day-to-day work for quite a while before they could ever think about bringing that forward.
Even to the extent of the teams not liking KPIs, they hated the KPIs that were enforced. So they had quite significant conversations about use of data and use of key performance indicators. And that sounded like that got very tense from just listening, because we were listening to both the senior people telling us about it, then the next layer would tell us, and the next layer, and then the families. And it was very interesting to hear similar language, but also the willingness to work through issues so that, it was that thing about, I think it was Sal said, there are certain things that you actually have to be able to measure and report on, but they're saying that the way you do it is disempowering, blah, blah. It was actually very interesting to hear how it permeated through the whole organisations, and the families were very amazing. When they talked about their histories, they were very complex families in the same complexity that we deal with. And they kept saying that really. There's nothing special about. It's not special. They're not special families. They're not different.
We've got a question at the back.
Hi, I'm a student, a social work student, so bear with me if this sounds naive. What did Leeds do differently that we currently don't do here in Australia in regards to having the multiple services as the one piece of that pie, like within communication with services? Because to have them as one piece, but there be multiple services, there has to be some form of communication between them. What is Leeds doing that we're not doing here?
Well, I think as Kathy said earlier, that they've got a common framework. And Anne-Marie and Kathy have just outlined how they can talk to each other. They can problem solve together. They can disagree. They can debate. They can work through it. But they're using their restorative principles, which was the thing, I guess, that Craig was saying as well. They're making sure that people believe that people can solve their problems rather than that we have to solve their problems for them. Like, that's the whole doing with. And in fact, they working and using processes that make those families work on the issues with them. In fact, it becomes an escalated child protection issue if the family won't work with them. But they kept showing that the more they've done things like get rid of tables, even though I did my collaborative one as a table, that's part of my resistance. But but they would take their meetings out to the families and find that, they had contact with 4 members of the family, but something like 22 members of the family would get involved. Now, we are not ready to do that with multiple services yet. And I think the things that, again, we've said already are that they've got the trust to do that. They're prepared to go out and be out there with the family and debate and disagree and...
You've got to remember the system though. So I know I sound like I'm the note of caution, but the social care arrangements in the UK are different. And so anyone who's ever worked in the UK knows that they have a social care approach at the local government. So that's not to say we can't do some of that, but even it was very interesting to me because I have a real eye on the early childhood and the CAFs because I've been watching them for a long time. And some of their home visiting and their early childhood was slightly disconnected. So you can learn from Leeds, we can learn, because some of the discussions we've been having about an early help and support, myself and Sue from Child Protection went and looked at their early help and support approach. Now, that was quite interesting. That does not rely on a structured social care approach, but it does rely on a structured approach to us all being in that early help and support. So there's certain things we can adapt based on the way we structure our workforce and our organisations, because we've got them. We're not the same as the UK. We're not. And Westminster was very similar. We went there as well.
Yeah.
And they also have their
Name
social
dropper.
care all together. We had a great time. Yeah, we don't talk about it too much, but their social care arrangements are slightly different. And they have to be frank, they have a very strong social work profession, very strong, very underpinned by probably slightly different than Australia. It felt really different and I don't know, lots of you have worked in the UK, so you will know that the profession is seen differently in the UK than it is here. And, some registration might help that, who knows?
Any other questions? So I think there was one here. Yep, thanks.
That's good.
I'm Linda Forrest and I work in homelessness. There's several things that I want to talk to you about, especially and you. But I've been to different training around restorative practices. One lot of training I went to was over 3 days, and a whole school community, one of our whole school communities down south has done this training. The parents are all doing the training and a number of service providers around them are doing the training, restorative practices. I guess as an ex-public servant, who never went on an overseas trip, we do these study tours, we do the reorganisations and we do a whole lot of stuff. I guess my frustration in homelessness is we're catching the people that the rest of the system has absolutely failed. So that's a whole lot of that information about. We do identify these families that are struggling at financial counselling. That's the first time they put up the hand. It's when they're going to lose their house. So there's a whole lot of early warning signs. I left the public service after trying to do the work of Joe Weatherall's dream of, which I think was a correct dream, of bringing together early years nursing, child protection and education, but we had systems and departments that didn't want to come together. So we keep doing that. We use all the language. Is this something that we're actually going to try and test and use in a region or something, or is it just another phrase that we're going to come back in 2 years and you'll put restorative practice up on your
I reckon that's a really good question, Linda, because I think there's a danger if we think it's quick, let's get everyone trained in restorative practice and we'll all restore. In fact, the takeout from Leeds, and Claire made a couple of these points, and if you'd met Sal, this is the stuff where I said I wanted to flag they'd moved on, and I actually picked them up on the last day and I said, you aren't using the language of restorative practice anymore. And they said, no, it had its place and what we need to do. What I took out was, number one, and I think Claire flagged this in her presentation, this did not happen overnight. No. This has been a 10-year journey. So first of all, have a long-term vision, commit to it. Things will go badly wrong at different times, but don't lose the clarity. There is no magic course that's going to transform South Australia or any jurisdiction towards this. It's actually going to take those elements that Claire teased out about leadership and all of that. When we really sat down with their social work teams and actually pulled this apart and really started to explore it, what we were starting to talk about was good social work practice, like right at the heart of it, professional judgment and decision making. We were actually talking about accountability, not blame. And I really felt, and Claire has raised, I think, some of these. It's a great question to ask, because I do think there is a danger. People think, you're beauty. And now in 2 years, all of the South Australian issues will be resolved. What we want is, we want an agreed practice approach that we all sign up and line up to, that we use language that is actually meaningful, and that we actually honour and value the profession, which is one of the takeouts I had of social work. And, meeting with another person, and can I tell you, in all of my times, it waited till I got to be a CE to get an overseas trip, so I know what you mean.
I didn't want to go.
No, she felt like she had to go. But it's a really good question about it, is one of the things that I really took out of it was when meeting with Eileen Munro, who to me is probably the doyen of, thinking about social work practice in child protection. And Eileen's coming out later this year to Australia. She really reminded us about pay attention, to how you do your work. Like, don't just think if your leads are fired or you put, the thumbs up, or you quickly get the stamp, that's going to transport you. This is going to be hard. This is going to take long-term commitments. This is going to take leadership, optimism. It's all Claire's beautiful reflections on there. I just think that's my big takeout is, it's why we do child protection work for so many in the room. You don't do it because you're going to get a result tomorrow. You've got to start to change systems. And you're right, what we're seeing is families and children falling through gaps. And I think the other thing that really, and I want to just go back to something Anne-Marie flagged about, Sarah, it was your question of the early years. One of the things that really struck us about boroughs or the councils that were doing well as opposed to the ones that hadn't, was they were still investing in their children's services. So both Leeds and Westminster and Hammersmith and a couple of them said to us, we hadn't gotten rid of our children's services when times got tough.
Yeah.
We didn't get rid of our playgroups. And I've been trying to tell as many of Anne-Marie's crowd that message because, in fact, and when Leeds said to us, we're prioritising our children's services over the roads, I said, what do you mean? They said, we're not fixing some of the potholes. And I was like, I probably do want you to fix the pothole. But what it really struck us was it's not about one thing. They were making a choice. If we look after children, we look after society. Yeah.
Even with 10 years of austerity.
Sorry, Claire, I was taking all your good
all
work.
good. I think there are lots of things I do differently from Leeds as well.
Yeah.
And one of them is data and evaluation.
Yeah.
I mean, they're doing RBA and they're seeing really good results, but they're not as committed to sort of looking at the unique needs of families in the same way. And maybe it is partly that they've got a set of services that are sort of work and they don't, they've got places to refer them to or something. But I think it's an inspiration though to see what they've done, and I think that we as a sector need to be able to celebrate that, and we need those visions. And so I think, and their generosity was in they walked out of the room and left us with everybody from clients through to every layer, people that had been in the organisation for 6 months. Do you know what I mean? Like they're not selling anything, but they are sharing their success because we need success in this
Over
industry.
10 years.
That's right. And so I think that's what it's worth honouring Leeds about.
Yeah, I'm going to use that as a lovely segue to wind it up.
Sorry.
So I just want to say, I think you're right, Claire, and that is a lovely way to end this presentation, is that we do need to have a vision and we do need to continue having conversations about this. And so I want to thank Claire for leading this conversation tonight, and also for the panel being prepared to be put under the spotlight and join in this conversation. So can we thank Claire and the panel?
I've got a bruise on my knee.
We do have just some little gifts for Claire and the panel. While they've been given out, I also just want to invite people to do some further networking. I think the drinks and nibbles are still there. So if you need a quick refresh before you go home, please do.
Quick skull.
I also want to thank you for attending tonight's social transformation lecture. And watch this space. We, as a college, are committed to running these about 3 times a year. This has been our second one. So our next one will be towards the end of the year. So again, thank you very much for your time.